and we're going to end up in Fiji. You're calling these things victories. And Omar still thinks BDS is victorious. Why? Because Israel keeps attacking it. So it must be doing something right. He still calculates all the disasters that have befallen not just the Palestinian people, but the Palestine Solidarity Movement. He calculates them all as victories. You know, you wonder what would the defeat look like if these are all victories.
Do you think
but I'm
that?
not, as I said, I'm immune to the guilt tripping. I paid my price. I paid my dues. You're not going to label me out of existence. You may silence me, which they were pretty effective. I wasn't able to speak anymore to an audience, but I'm not going to be intimidated. I mean, I went through that as a kid with the in the United States with the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers are the vanguard of the revolution. And your job as a white person is to simply do whatever they tell you to do because they're the oppressed and they represent the oppressed. Okay, I passed through that phase of that phase of idiocy.
So just the next question is about Gaza again. In your book,
I'm surprised you have no follow-up on that question. To avoid it.
Well, I was going to say I was going to kind of partly defend BDS because I do think that there's an aspect of it which is beneficial, which is the cultural side. Because when, for example, like a famous pop singer says like, "I'm not going to perform in Israel," I think it could have like a positive educational role because that pop star has like millions of followers on Twitter or whatever, and then if she announces like, "I'm not going to perform in Israel because of the human rights abuses," then it could lead her followers to like research the conflict and like learn more about it. So I do think like that side of it could have a positive like educational role. But I agree with your broader criticisms of the movement. But do you think that aspect could be positive?
Let's be clear. If you go back to the South Africa anti-apartheid, the international anti-apartheid sanctions movement, which played a role, not the decisive role, but a role in bringing down the apartheid regime. How big a role is a question mark, but it played a role. I've read up on it. I lived through that, and I read up on it very carefully. That movement was very serious. There was an enormous amount written of a very high scholarly quality on what to target and how effective the targeting was. So they targeted oil that was going to South Africa. They targeted banks that were investing in South Africa. They targeted companies which were investing in South Africa. They looked for the weak links in the South African empire, which was an empire. They looked for the weak links, targeted, and then periodically they tweeted their strategy based on what the economists who were studying it were telling them about the effectiveness of their strategy. Of all of the various components of this anti-apartheid sanctions movement, the least significant was the cultural boycott, with the exception of the sports boycott, which had some impact. Had some impact. But the cultural boycott was the most problematic. Um, and it was most problematic for a simple reason that you have to have a connection between your tactic and your goal. So, targeting the South African arms industry, that clearly had a relationship with the goal. Targeting the oil, well, oil was used to finance the war machine. Targeting investment, well, you wanted to bring to kneel the big industry, the capitalist class in South Africa. With culture, it's always gray. It's a gray area because they say, well, we use culture to bring people together and we want to reach out to people. We don't want to ostracize them. You know, all the litany. So that was always the weak link in the South African anti-apartheid strategy. You're way too young to remember. I don't know. Do either of you have ever heard of Paul Simon, of Simon and Garfunkel?
Yeah, my parents are fans.
Okay. And Tommaso, do you know who Paul Simon was?
Yeah, my dad is a fan as well.
Well, so Paul Simon broke the cultural boycott. And he went to South Africa, established a band with South African performers, and he came and he toured with it. And there was a lot of ambivalence within the anti-apartheid movement. You go back, Google Paul Simon, South Africa. It's worth it for you to look at. Because there was a lot of ambivalence. On the one hand, he was giving exposure to South Africans, and he was playing a positive role. Others said no. So, what's my point? My point is, VDS was completely unserious. They had one economist, a nice guy, Schurhever from Germany, I guess. They had one economist who really, he's a nice guy, but his analysis was very weak. I don't want to say anything against him because he's a nice guy. I know his heart's in the right place. They had one economist, one. And they focused on the weakest link, the cultural aspect. That's the one that's the most problematic. Because it's so, at a certain point, they were attacking Edward Said's wife for being part of, well, you're nodding your head, attacking Edward Said's wife for being, she took over his position as the director of the West Eastern Diwan Orchestra, because it was, they said, because, well, who even cares, because it was performing in Israel, it was Israel-based, and because they had Jews in the orchestra, who knows? It was the weakest link. They never had economists trying to scientifically, if we can use that word, scientifically study the Israeli economy and look what should we target. They never had anyone doing that. It was completely unserious. It's because Omar doesn't like Israeli intellectuals and Israeli culture. He finds it a personal affront to him as an Arab. It was all this kind of Arab, if you know Nietzsche, the ressentiment. Where did Omar go to study? He went to study at Tel Aviv University. Why did he study at Tel Aviv? You have a cultural boycott. Why are you studying at Tel Aviv University? He said, oh, the oppressed have no choice. No, Omar, you had a choice. I know you, Omar. You went to Columbia University. You would have been the valedictorian. He had straight A's, except one, and I'm sure he's telling the truth. One Zionist professor, as he put it, gave him a C. Otherwise, he would have been a valedictorian. He was a good student. You're telling me that of all the universities in the world, the only place you could study philosophy was Tel Aviv, with a degree from Columbia University and a near perfect grade point average? The only school you could study at, the oppressed have no choices. You had a lot of choices. He chose Tel Aviv because he wants to prove Arabs are the equal of Israelis. He has this love-hate relationship with the Israelis. He wants to prove they're the equals. So he's going to study moral philosophy. I mean, would you want to study moral philosophy at Tel Aviv University? That's like studying the history of Judaism at Hitler U. Doesn't seem to me a perfect fit with studying moral philosophy. It was all this personal thing. It had nothing to do with politics. Nothing at all to do with politics. When you look at the BDS movement, a lot of them, it's not the BDS, the South African anti-apartheid sanctions movement. A lot of them were former communists, and not former, they were still communists. Very serious. I mean, they were the good and the bad side of being a communist. The bad side is totally ruthless, but the good side, very serious, committed, no nonsense. We sit down, we do the math. We do the math. Is this working or is it not working? Is this working or is it not working? We retool, we tweak, get it right, get it precise. We have a cause. We're dedicated to that cause. We're actually fanatically dedicated to that cause. That was the communist mindset. It had its good and its bad side. I respect the intensity of commitment. I can't say I respect the ruthlessness. You know, the best thing that ever happened to Nelson Mandela was he ended up in jail. I know it's a terrible thing. It sounds like a terrible thing, but he then managed to stay pure. If he had been out in the field, remember, he was the head of the armed wing of the African National Congress. He would have ended up having a lot of blood in his hands, and he would have had to act in a ruthless fashion in order to survive. That's the nature of the armed struggle. Armed struggle is a necessity in certain situations, but one shouldn't turn a necessity into a virtue. If it makes the person who's the most ruthless the one who rises to the top. And ruthless in armed struggle means the one who has the most blood in his or her hands. That's just the nature of the beast. I'm not condemning it, I'm just speaking factually. So the communist heritage has a lot in its favor. They were the ones that defeated the Nazis. They were the ones that led the resistance throughout Europe. But there's also a large element of ruthlessness. But on our topic at hand, they did the sanctions movement very seriously. I read through the literature. I was actually kind of amazed at the degree of scholarly precision, analysis, sophistication. Did you see any of that in BDS? All I heard was a slogan, BDS, like open sesame, abracadabra, BDS. Did you see any analysis of how the Israeli economy works? What are its weak links? What should we target? Was there any analysis at all? Zero. Absolute zero. How could you win like that?
So I'm not sure how you're doing for time, but